I have the pleasure of getting to continue to preach through the book of Esther this morning. If you recall, if you've joined us the last few weeks, we're in Esther 4 right now. What's happened up until this point is Queen Esther was chosen in a beauty contest, effectively, to become the queen of the realm alongside of Xerxes the king. And Esther is Jewish. And her uncle, or cousin, Mordecai, has recently found out that there is a plot that is being hatched by the evil Haman, who is that's right, Haman, is one of the king's men to annihilate the Jewish people. And so we're gonna read through just a section of Esther 4. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want you to get sort of the gist of what's happening right now in this moment in the story. So then Esther told Hadad, so Mordecai had just told Esther about what was going to happen. So then Esther told Hadad, who was the king's eunuch, to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called me to come for 30 days. So Hadad gave Esther's message to Mordecai. So Mordecai had come and said, hey, Esther, this is going to happen. It's really bad. And she's saying, look, I would love to help. I'd love to help the Jewish people. But if I go to the king, I'm going to die. That's the law. So Mordecai sent this reply back to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? So then Esther sent a reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So I have 3 observations I want to share with you this morning. The first is that our position affects our perspective. The second is that our perspective affects our practice. And finally, our practice must be informed by the gospel. So we're really at the turning point of this story where our hero, Esther, is faced with her own humanity. She's faced with a choice. And at first, she fails the test. Right? Her first response, if you read again on 9:11, she says, look, if I go before the king, I'm going to die. Right? I can't do this. So what Esther was demonstrating in this moment was really a profound sense of entitlement. Right? She felt like she was safe. Her position in this culture was impacting her perspective. And this is actually true for all of us. How we interpret the world is inextricably linked to our education, our upbringing, our status in society, our wealth, our race. All of these things, our political alignments, all of these things inform how we see the world. And the Bible's very clear about this, that we see through a glass darkly. It's from 1 Corinthians 13. What that means is that we don't always see the world as it really is. We have a tremendous amount of confidence in our own knowledge and understanding. I remember having a lunch one time with a colleague back when I was consulting a number of years ago, and we were having lunch with a client, and after the lunch he said, you know, the client had left. He said, I don't know if you actually know what you're talking about, but you really sound like you do. It's like, wow, thanks. And Kim could probably tell you another dozen stories about this very same issue. But yeah, I am supremely confident in a whole bunch of things I probably don't know that much about. Did you know that 93% of Americans are in the top 50% of drivers, according to themselves? 93%. Like, that's all of us, right? In fact, they've done so many studies on this that we, as humans, attribute our own success to skill and hard work, And what do you think we could attribute the success of others to? Good luck. That's right. and the same thing with our misfortune, right? When something, our failures, it's like, well, yeah, this happened and this happened, it wasn't my fault. But when we see other people fail, we're like, well, they're just an idiot. We do this all the time, right? Because we allow our interpretation of others' situation and our own situation to be influenced by our own experiences. And Esther, at this point in her life, she was in a position of power. She had been selected by the king to be the queen. And with that power came this sense of safety, this sense of protection, right? And she thought that she would be unaffected by this catastrophe that was happening around her. So many of you who know me know that I work in the space of energy and climate, and I've been reading a book lately. It's a book of essays about the climate movement and things that are going on there. And one particular essay jumped out at me as I was preparing for this sermon, just because it paralleled so well, I think, Esther's situation. And this is from a woman named Abigail Dillon. She's a lawyer and a president of a nonprofit. And she writes that support for climate action correlates with the perception of climate risk. For many people who have been comfortable until now, it is seemingly impossible to accept that anything so disruptive as climate change is possible. Either it's a hoax or things will somehow continue to be fine. It's a profound kind of entitlement to believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that we can go on living as we are. And this was Esther, right? She had a sense of comfort that she could continue living as she was, and she would not be harmed. She would not be affected. And she couldn't put herself in the position at that moment of the other people that were going to be suffering. Her perception was affecting her reality, but it was a distorted view of reality. And Mordecai, he was having none of it. I mean, you just have to love his response here. And as I was reading through this passage, I started thinking about, if I was going to make a movie about this, I would definitely cast Samuel L. Jackson in the place of Mordecai just to give this speech. And it would not be PG-13. And it probably wasn't at the time, because you can just hear the anger and the indignation of Mordecai when he responds to Esther. And he says, do you honestly think that you're the only one who's going to escape? You won't. You're going to die, and your family's going to die. And he says, and the irony is, Esther, someone else is going to step up. Like, God is going to redeem his people, and you're going to die. And Esther, in a lot of ways, she's being called by God to use her position of power to address this inequity and injustice. In a lot of ways, she's like it's the quintessential superhero story, right? This is Tony Stark moving from being the spoiled, billionaire brat to realizing that he has a power and that he has to use it to address injustice in the world. Like, that's the story of Esther. It's the inspiration for almost every superhero story that we've ever heard. And so after her initial reluctance, and again, what I imagine to be a profanity-laced speech from Mordecai, our hero steps up and she really assumes the role she was created for. Perhaps it's you, Esther, who's being called in this moment. Perhaps it's you who's being called. And what's Esther's response? So be it. If I die, I die. Her perspective had changed. She went from being someone who felt safe and entitled to realizing that she doesn't get to sit in her position of safety and power and not lean into the injustice that was happening around her. This was really her woman in the arena moment. I was thinking again and making the movie in my head. I'm like, this is where you have that rousing speech from William Wallace or whatever, that she finally turns and realizes, like, this is what I was called to do. So I'm going to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt here. The credit belongs to the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends herself a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if she fails, at least she fails while daring greatly, so that her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. See, this is Esther in this moment. She has a new perspective. And her perspective is affecting her practice. So in 2008, ExxonMobil was the most valuable company in the world, by a long shot. Today, most of the big tech companies could buy Exxon and have cash left over. We have seen in the last 10 years a tremendous amount of wealth and power ceded to just a handful of companies. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Apple, each of these companies are worth somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion. Right? And this, of course, is right in our backyard. In fact, if I talk loud enough, Jeff and Bill could probably hear us. We have decided that we're going to allow these companies to grow to just this massive amount of wealth and power. If you've had a chance to watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I highly recommend it if you want to really think about how these companies are using their power. But what strikes me, I work for Microsoft, and our president, Brad Smith, wrote a book last year called Tools and Weapons, and what he was describing was how tech companies particularly, because of the power and influence they have in our culture today, have a responsibility to think about how they use that. And he said, look, if you create technology that changes the world, you bear some responsibility for the world you create. You're not allowed to just build these tools and send them out into the world, things like facial recognition technology, and go, oh, well, I don't know if people, human rights are abused and other things, that's not our problem. No, it is your problem because you created that tool, right? And so we've actually called for government regulation of facial recognition technology. We want the government to step in and put the guardrails in place so that there's protections for people using these technologies. But it extends beyond that. A couple of examples recently in our own backyard. So last year, Microsoft put in place a $750 million fund for affordable housing in the Puget Sound area. Well, why did Microsoft do that? Well, in part because part of the reason it's so unaffordable to live here is because of Microsoft and because of Amazon, right? It's these companies that have attracted all this talent and driven up the cost of housing. And so, as our executives were looking at that, they said, we're actually partly responsible for this, and therefore, with the power and the influence we have, we should do something about it. Just this last year, when COVID hit, we, of course, are all working from home. The company decided that all of our hourly employees, the people that drive our shuttle buses that commute around Puget Sound, which are not running right now, people that work in our cafes, work on our campus, all of those employees would be paid their full salary for the duration of the COVID crisis, even though they're not working, right? Why did they do that? Because it's the right thing to do. See, Microsoft has an obligation to address injustice in its backyard precisely because it has the power to do so. It's not required to do so, but it has that power as an influence, and it needs to have, as a company, it needs to have that right perspective of the power that's been given. That's really Esther, right? She too was in this position of power, and once that perspective changed, she realized, I have to wield this power to address injustice. I have no choice. And so it's important not just to note that Esther was willing to act, but what she was standing for. See, Esther demonstrates an ethic of standing against injustice in opposition to political and societal norms. I think we tend to romanticize civil disobedience when we look back, because that's what this was. This was a massive act of civil disobedience. I mean, could you just imagine the gossip in the palace starting to hear that, wait a minute, Esther's going to go talk to the king? Like, this would have been an absolute scandal. And so, but again, we look back at it and we're like, oh, this is a heroic thing. No, if you were in the palace at the time, you probably would have been shocked and awed as well. When Martin Luther King was murdered, 75% of Americans disapproved of him and his tactics. I mean, think about that for a minute. Like, someone that we celebrate today as a hero, that in his day, when he was doing those things, he was not viewed that way widely across this country. So we look back on these things and we miss the scandal. And so I don't want you to miss like how scandalous this moment was for what Esther was doing and the amount of bravery it took, the amount of risk to her reputation, to her comfort, and then ultimately to her life. Like, she was willing to risk her life for this thing that she believed in. But by all accounts, like, Esther didn't set out to become a revolutionary. She didn't want to be queen. She was selected in this beauty contest. After the first queen was disappointed, King Xerxes, she didn't, again, going back to her first response to Mordecai, she didn't necessarily want to be in this situation. Her initial response was, no, I'm pretty good. Like, I'm pretty comfortable. But her power, plus her willingness to gain a new perspective, resulted in a change to her practice. She knew that she had to act. So finally, like, our practice and our hope for restoration, our hope that we can address inequality and injustice, it must be rooted in what is true and unchanging. It must be rooted in the gospel. See, if we root our practice in our current perspective, we are always going to be swayed from side to side. We are always going to be informed by whatever the last thing is that we read or whatever the last thing we saw on the news. But if we can come back to the gospel and we can root our practice in that, we can ensure that we can be consistent and we cannot be swayed by the waves of opinion, by the waves of what's happening in our political sphere. And so the question is your hope really rooted in the gospel? Or is your hope rooted in what happens next Tuesday? So I know for a lot of us, we're really distracted right now about what's going to happen on Tuesday. Do you think that the gospel of Jesus Christ in any way will be thwarted by who's sitting in the Oval Office on January 20th? One person does. Okay. I appreciate your bravery. Look, the only way that the gospel is thwarted is if Christians start to believe that it can be. But even that's not really true. That's what we just learned from Esther, right? God is going to work. He doesn't need me. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need politicians. His gospel is going to go forward. And just as if Esther had not stepped up, he would have used someone else. Because his pursuit of his people is not going to be thwarted by men and women. That's for sure. Not by kings, not by rulers, not by political parties. See, we can't allow ourselves to become a people of misplaced hope. If our hope for a better future or a return to a past that we thought better, if our hope is in that, then we're people with misplaced hope. See, Jesus' ministry was not at all about using political power. He spent most of his ministry focused on restoring outcasts back into community with others, restoring the position of racial minorities, of women, of people who are sick, of people who are poor. That was his ministry. It had nothing to do with politics. Peter Wehner, who was a speechwriter for Reagan and both Bush administrations, wrote recently that evangelical Christians have not brought anything distinctively Christian to politics. One would hope that people of faith would act differently from members of political interest groups, that followers of Jesus would passionately defend human dignity, champion justice, create conditions of human flourishing without being co-opted by any political party or power structure. One might expect that they would care for the weak and the vulnerable, including the unborn and those living in the shadows of society, promote ordered liberty, empathy, compassion, especially towards those viewed as social outcasts and aliens, one of the most striking features of the ministry of Jesus. And speak out time and time again, if necessary, against political leaders, including those who advance a political agenda they believe in, if those leaders are cruel, pathologically dishonest, lawless, and if they dehumanize their enemies. See, what's being described here is completely countercultural to our current political moment. And the problem is that Christian ethics, if we think about what does it actually mean to be a Christian, it cannot exist apart from Christ. You cannot disconnect it. You can't turn it in to a list of policy prescriptions, a list of to-dos. It doesn't work because it necessitates the Holy Spirit. It necessitates a heart that is changed. It is not something we can just try harder and do. So it can't be articulated. You can't just get some rational person to believe everything that a Christian believes of what it means to be a Christian just by trying to explain it to them better. Like, they will never be able to understand it unless the Holy Spirit comes upon them, unless the Holy Spirit changes their heart. I remember back to my Econ 101 class from college. The professor opened the class by saying, economics is a science of greed. Economics is the science of greed. And what that means is that economies function because every individual in the economy is focused on maximizing his or her own utility. He's focused on getting as much as they can out of each and every transaction. See, we see this in business, we see it in politics, that maximizing individual power or the power of your tribe is viewed as good as long as it supports your end, right? That's a successful outcome. But God's economy doesn't work like man's economy. It doesn't work that way. So asking someone to espouse a Christian ethic who doesn't believe in the life-giving work of Jesus on the cross, it's like trying to explain cartography to someone who thinks the world is flat. Like, it's not, they just don't have the category to understand it. And so when we look at the radical disobedience of Esther in the face of injustice against the Jewish people, it wouldn't have made sense to the people in the palace. They wouldn't have been able to understand why would she be willing to risk everything. It wouldn't resonate. Jesus' ministry to restore dignity to social outcasts, it didn't make sense to the political leaders and the religious leaders of the day. Our pursuit of those same ends today, it shouldn't make sense to the world. They shouldn't be able to fully understand, why do we do the things we do? Why do we serve the way that we serve? Why are we willing to sacrifice for one another? It shouldn't make sense. See, Esther was able to do something extraordinary, not because of who she was, but ultimately because of what she believed to be true. And it was because she, too, recognized that she was an outcast. Once she realized, like, oh, wait a minute, I am those people. Like, I am the same. I have this perception of safety, but it's not reality. That change in her belief allowed her to ultimately do something extraordinary. And that's our story too. We can live a life of faithful obedience that transcends elections, that transcends political parties, that transcends nations. Because we too were outcasts that have been called into a restored relationship with Jesus. See, our perspective on the outcasts in our society today, those pleading for justice, those seeking a safe home, those trying to put food on their table, it should be the same as Esther's. Humble submission, walking faithfully as Jesus walked. Please pray with me. Lord, thank you for the opportunity just to come into your word and just have our hearts be quiet and humble and just for a few minutes, really just get to reflect on how you use the life of Esther, Lord, and ultimately how you're using our lives, how you're using the message of Jesus, his willingness to humbly sacrifice his own life, Lord, so that we could be saved, so that we could be a restored people, Lord, so that we can see ourselves as outcasts and know that you are redeeming all of us to yourself. I pray this in your name.